All right. I think I'm on Facebook. Let me just make sure I'm okay with the audio. And sorry, one sec, guys. Yep, I'm live. Okay. Cool. Hey, guys. What's up, Elliot? Joseph? How's it going? Audio sounds good. Cool. Very good. So yeah, I'm kind of like in a haze because I was up very late last eve. So this particular pop-up live stream will be very stream of consciousness. But yeah, there's a lot going on, and I just kind of wanted to kind of do a riff on everything. And first of all the stuff at Neura. So, as you may have seen, we've got the live stream I did with Jen Zart, and we talked about her class this Thursday night called Astrology Rocks. It's going to be a 2-hour online seminar. And go ahead and check out the video. I'll link to it in the description of this. If you're watching this afterwards, you'll be able to just click that. But it's going to be awesome. It's going to be Thursday evening. And we're going to go for about 2 hours, like I said. And Jen's also going to be on Mutations a little bit later after the class. I was just asking her. Another thing about Mutations. So good news, Connor Habib has also agreed to be on the show. So if you don't know Connor, he's a really cool guy. We've been interacting for a few years, but he is, or was, I think is as well, still, English professor, porn star, writer, anthroposophist. Yeah, Elliot. We got Connor on the show, and I asked him to be on Neura as well. So we're going to see about possibly doing a class as well, which is really awesome. But at the very least, he's going to be on Mutations, and we're going to have an interesting conversation. Connor's really cool. He's an anthroposophist. He's a Rudolf Steiner's whole philosophy. Brilliant philosopher himself, and sort of a postmodern thinker. He really gets the sort of postmodern. Yeah, I heard Habib on Future Fossils. He's great on that. He was also recently on the Duncan Trussell podcast trying to kind of curb, or was it the opposite? I think Trussell was on his podcast, which is sort of a video podcast in LA, but they were talking about strange esoteric realms and evil, the problem of evil and all this stuff. So I really recommend that as well. Good stuff. So yeah, Connor's going to be on Mutations. Jen Zart's going to be on Mutations. We'll get some more people. And what I like about this, maybe I can kind of start to merge this with Neura a little bit as kind of like, my Patreon event, and a podcast, I suppose, because we're going to have people on for conversations that go about an hour. But it kind of works with Neura's idea of shows. So there must be some hybrid way of framing this to kind of bring everything, converge everything together. And of course, Jen and I were going to talk Revelor and all of our real fun projects that we're working on. One of which I will be announcing to my patrons pretty soon. It's an anthology project for Revelor, and I'm really excited about it. Actually, I think it's sort of it sort of arose organically. It's sort of exactly what I feel like we need right now in terms of consciousness culture literature, sort of embracing and engaging with a more leaning into postmodernism, as I've been kind of talking about in these live streams, kind of leaning into the thought structures and the styles of thinking stylistically and aesthetically and intellectually that I think are really necessary for our time, that are more rare in the kind of consciousness culture, in terms of there being a kind of consciousness culture with intellectual teeth, right? So that's what we're doing at Neura. That's what we're doing at Revelor Press, and that's what we want to do with this anthology. So all this fun stuff is happening. And then, of course, as some of you know, I'm doing a fundraiser, all sorts of stuff, right? The fundraiser is right there, just linked to it, and that is for the IEC, the Integral European Conference, which I've already mentioned in a previous Mutation/live stream, and that's really part of a larger project to get Gepser to the IEC. And by that, I just, to simply summarize what I've already been mentioning in previous episodes, it's to get Gepser in dialogue with sort of the integral theory folks, evolution of consciousness folks. Not that he isn't already kind of implicitly there in a lot of what they're doing. It's just he's not really pronounced explicitly. And I think, with the work that I'm doing, with the book that I'm writing, and now the anthology that I'm working on, that Gebser's work is particularly helpful for thinking as one of the important thinkers to wrestle with the crisis, the crisis and mutation that we're in right now, which is actually a theme of one of the Gebser conferences I helped put together. But the problems of the Anthropocene and the climate change and the climate crisis and all of these different things and the styles of thinking that are starting to emerge sort of organically, not really explicitly in a specific culture that identifies itself as integral. Very interesting, very useful, very helpful. And I think bringing Gebser back in dialogue with popular culture, media studies, art, contemporary art, and so on, and some contemporary thinkers. Like right now I'm reading, what's his name? Mark Fisher on my Kindle here, Ghosts of My Life, and of course his capitalist realism book. So I'm kind of exploring some of these sort of, from that angle, and sort of bringing Gebser into dialogue with that kind of economic cultural critique. It's not all economics, but that sort of idea of late capitalism and what it does to time and how time kind of gets into stasis and arrest. But then also how, the mental rationalist sort of, in some way, it speeds up time. So we've got the opposite problem happening at the same time, right? With what Rushkoff calls, present shock, and the kind of mimicking of the integral consciousness through this sort of deficient mental rational, through some of the problems of digital time that's always on. It kind of speeds up into this infinite present, but it's not exactly a mystical infinite present, nor an integral one at all times, because of the way it kind of, what would you call it? It removes the biological time, right? So like it's sort of always on. There's sort of this problem, of course, like Silicon Valley and modern workers and that kind of stuff, of this sort of always on culture, always connected. The rhythmicity of the sort of magic and the mythical are having some trouble with it. Not entirely. And I don't think that's all what it is, because there's a lot of interesting stuff also going on with digital culture that's sort of a-perspectival and playing with time. Time is a kind of integral remixing. So interesting stuff. I'm kind of going on a rant here, right? But so yeah, that's sort of what I'm interested in doing with the IEC, and just bringing Gebser there and talking about Gebser and integral culture and everything else. So yeah, welcome everybody. I see a lot of other people are popping on now. Dave and Maya and Jay and Marcin. Marcin was on, or Martin. We were on. I've never pronounced your name out loud, though we've been good friends through our PKD class, which is another neuro class that just recently ended with Richard Doyle. And Richard's going to be back, so don't worry about that. Richard's definitely going to be back for another class. We're talking about it tomorrow, just sort of what to do next. And he's also very involved with Revelor, excitingly, and there'll be more announcements about that as we move forward this year. But yeah, so like I thought I would move, instead of just talking about the conference in late May. I just recently wrote, for some of you have seen it, the meeting the alien, the Annihilation film review, right? So I thought I might read a little bit of that and kind of riff on that a little bit. And I also have a reading from Annihilation itself, which I feel kind of sums up. It's not really a spoiler. It's just a scene. It's a very kind of poetic scene that I feel really kind of encapsulates the book and the feeling of the book. And then I can kind of go into that philosophically. So here we go. So first of all, I don't know if anybody's seen Annihilation, but if you guys haven't, try to go see it. I've heard mixed things about people not being able to see it as much or as well. The show getting canceled. Somebody mentioned that yesterday, so it's really too bad. I really hope that this backfires on Paramount, and Netflix gets this little fascinating movie that everybody's going to see, and it's going to be one of their big hits, I guess, at least internationally. But the movie is not without its problems, as I write in the review. It's got some issues, but and mainly because I've read the books, all three, and the books are they just do a better job with the thematics that the movie also does, but not as well, arguably. And the book goes further, and it's a book, so of course, very often books can go further, right? So I can't really blame the film. And also Garland has admitted, Alex Garland, the director, has admitted that this is his sort of imaginative take. He didn't even reread the book. He just kind of he said he wrote the script thinking about how the book made him feel. So it was all kind of an impressionist approach to the book Annihilation, Vandermeer's Annihilation, which is respectable. It's kind of like Stephen King's The Shining versus Kubrick's The Shining. There's just there's a radically different take, and you kind of have to accept that the film is very, very different, trying to be just as sort of, or more so, breathtaking. And I don't think it was more so necessarily. It's just a different breed of weird. So anyway, one of the parts of this, I'll just read it for you. Yeah. So what's interesting in the film, right? So yeah, okay. So a single cell in the primordial soup billions of years ago becomes two. It meets its doppelganger, and on from there, life stretches on like one giant superorganism stretched across time and form. Plants and animals and everything in between. Garland's Annihilation is interested in the cell, in one becoming two, in copies and doppelgangers, in mutation, in the meeting of the other, in becoming the other. The characters and the thematics of the film explore why life terminates itself, cells dying, for instance, is a replication error, but an error that has persisted in most life forms. It also confronts us with the possibility in the shimmer, which is Area X, the kind of strange thing that you're seeing in the trailers, of life being something that we ultimately cannot know. In the opening scene, Lena is grilled by the Southern Reach facility. She's being interrogated after surviving Area X, right? Which isn't a spoiler because the movie opens this way. Was it an organism, an alien? What did it want? Each question to which Lena can only answer, I don't know. This idea of confronting the unfathomable and the limits of our reason and madness is a theme picked up from Lovecraft's cosmic horror, but also adapted from Vandermeer's writings as well, in what we can call eco-horror or weird ecology. And here, in two very different ways, the book and the movie explore this idea that life itself is some unfathomable thing, that we are part of that thing. The intrusion from the outside of the narrow confines of the real can break in at any moment, but we end up being that. You are that. When we confront the alien, we oddly confront ourselves, our uncanny selves. Mutation results, and any annihilation that takes place may simply be the way life moves aside the old order for a leap into the marvelously strange and new. And you'll see what I mean in the third act. So that is sort of a prelude, right, to Vandermeer's book, which I have right here, the actual book Annihilation. And so I'm just going to read one section from that in which the protagonist is, so the protagonist, as if you don't know, is a biologist. And Vandermeer, through his style of writing, a stylistic approach to writing, first of all, he's sort of a nature writer, sort of a hidden nature writer. Because a lot of his books, while they are fantastical, like Southern Reach trilogy and Born, he himself takes a lot of walks in nature. He spent, I think a better part of a decade or longer in a stretch of Florida wilderness, a preserve, with a real lighthouse, and so on. And all of these kinds of things of really kind of being in these ecosystems and taking walks in these ecosystems to fuel his creativity and his writing, have really kind of come out through the pages. And the same thing with Bourne, and I believe I haven't read Bourne yet, but what he was saying about Bourne is, while Annihilation is kind of looking at sort of ecology, nature, in places that we would associate with, not necessarily unspoiled, but more, wild environments, and looking at nature in urban environments and the sort of hidden ecosystems in our backyard, which the book does, Annihilation does as well. But the protagonist is a biologist, and throughout the book, you have these beautiful, sometimes disturbing, sometimes weird, uncanny, but strangely familiar resonance with the natural world or the unnatural world, or ecology as a sort of strange thing that we don't really grok, we don't really grasp. And that's sort of related to this idea that I think Vandermeer is friends with Tim Morton from Rice. I'm not exactly sure about the particulars there, but I know there's been some interaction and talk about it, especially in articles about the books. But what Tim Morton describes as hyperobjects, and also his theory, the philosophical theory of object-oriented ontology, which is this idea that no object, nothing we can perceive in our phenomenology and in our experience, is ultimately knowable. And I don't mean that in the kind of Kantian withdrawn sense about the correspondence in the world, in a stranger sense, in a sense that, like, as I've used as an example before, it's like a TARDIS, right? It's like it's bigger on the inside than the outside. The object, which we think is a sign, as my buddy J.F. Martel says, is actually a symbol. And so the kind of finite nature of perception that kind of reduces down to a sort of mental rational object is actually much more, and that goes for anything in the phenomenal experience, but especially as a meditation, the natural environment. So that's sort of my prelude to reading this from Annihilation, where the biologist is working in a tidal pool, and I think in the Pacific Northwest. So it starts: "What I found when I finally stood there, hands on bent knees, peering down into that tidal pool, was a rare species of colossal starfish," which is the image I used today for Mutations, "six-armed, larger than a saucepan, that bled a dark gold color into the still water as if it were on fire. Most of us professionals eschewed its scientific name for the more apt destroyer of worlds. It was covered in thick spines, and along the edges I could see, fringed with emerald green, the most delicate of transparent cilia, thousands of them propelling it along upon its appointed route as it searched for its prey, other lesser starfish. I had never seen a destroyer of worlds before, even in an aquarium, and it was so unexpected that I had forgot about the slippery rock, and, shifting my balance, almost fell, steadying myself with one arm propped against the edge of the tidal pool. But the longer I stared at it, the less comprehensible the creature became. The more it became something alien to me, the more I had a sense that I knew nothing at all about nature, about ecosystems. There was something about my mood and its dark glow that eclipsed sense, that made me see this creature, which had indeed been assigned a place in the taxonomy, cataloged, studied, and described, irreducible down to any of that. And I kept looking. I knew ultimately, I would have to admit, I knew less than nothing about myself as well, whether that was a lie or a truth. When I finally wrenched my gaze from the starfish and stood again, I could not tell where the sky met the sea, whether I faced the water or the shore. I was completely adrift and dislocated, and all I had to navigate by in that moment was the glowing beacon below me. So it's from Annihilation. Go read the book. That's all I have to say about Annihilation there. So yeah, I thought that really beautifully expressed this idea that, nothing, an encounter with the real will never be, no matter what we do, no matter how we catalog and transcribe and list and put something in a in taxonomy and map things, our encounter with the real, with reality, is always going to break that open if we allow the signs to become symbols, as J.F. Martel says, or if we allow, as Gebser says, to render transparent, the objects of perception. when he's talking about the structures of consciousness, but to render transparent what we would perceive as a fixed object in time and space in which we can know. Those are more of the useful lies. At Annihilation, he's saying that, I don't know. She's saying, I don't know if this is a truth or a lie. Certainly feels that way, but really the lie is the sort of construct we put around things, and it's a useful lie, and it's an empirical lie, and it helps us sort of understand the mechanics of the world in a conceptual space. But there's a limit to that reason, and I think with Annihilation and this sort of genre of weird ecology, we're kind of getting to this point, a healthy kind of what would you say, for a kind of not thinking of an immunological description, but a kind of a biological description. There's a sort of a breakdown of this way of thinking, this sort of mental rational way of thinking, as Heidegger described as sort of the gosh, what was he called? The something forth. Somebody help me out here. I can't remember it exactly, but it's in his famous essay on techne and poiesis. And a challenging forth of nature in standing reserve, to see nature, to see existence as basically, essentially a stocked shelf, a thing in which there are resources and objects in which we can manipulate and utilize through instrumentality. There is a natural kind of breakdown of that right now, and I think books like this are sort of training us for thinking in an ecological age. And Morton has a new book called Being Ecological, where he's sort of talking about this as well, but all of his books are talking about this. And it's this idea that, we have to start like in terms of what's beyond the mental rational, in terms of what the integral might look like. This kind of participation with nature, which is still using science, which is still using the mental rational and all these other structures, but there's the transparency in all of these things. There's a luminosity in these things, right? So like the idols have been rendered into icons in terms of the phenomenology of the world and the taxonomy of science, and that's really the only way to. That's what's happening whether we like it or not, right? So in terms of climate change and everything else, Morton was describing, he's down in Houston, Texas, and I think it was a very apt example and experience, something I experienced myself being here in Florida during the hurricanes. And he's describing the flooding that was going on in Houston and the animals crashing through the windows, birds running in a kitchen, right? In a flooded kitchen, squirrels and animals clutching onto things to try to get out, and humans and birds and animals and squirrels and rats and all types of creatures just sort of huddling together as the sea rose and the water and the storm brought in these changes. And it's this idea, this sort of ecological mind, that whether we like it or not, whether we want to maintain the barrier between civilization and nature, those days are over. And so the kind of consciousness we need is this kind of consciousness of looking at the starfish and its unfathomable presence, unfathomable being, right? So the kind of numinosity and luminosity of being, and sort of the aesthetics of being are these kinds of aesthetics of hyperobjects and so on. And Morton talks about this too. So that's sort of like something I'm exploring in my book in one of the chapters, specifically going on into ecology and sort of this sort of ecological mind, which I think aligns very well with what I've been saying about integral consciousness and the a-perspectival and so on. So yeah, I just like, I think reading books like this, as I've been saying, is really helpful. It helps get us in the right mind state of thinking about the weirdness of the present. And speaking of J.F. Martel, he's got a great podcast. I'm going to link it to you guys right now. Here you go. Let's see, weirdstudies.com. It's brand new, and it's just launched like a few weeks ago. Here's the link in the chat feed, guys. And so, yeah, Weird Studies, a filmmaker and a professor talk art and philosophy at the limits of the thinkable. And it's Phil Ford and J.F. Martel. They just had an episode with Eric Davis. And what I really liked about that episode is this Eric and JF and Phil were all saying basically, kind of switching subjects a little bit here, but it's related. That the consciousness culture or the counterculture, the kind of weirdness, the high weirdness of counterculture has sort of been naturalized or homogenized or assimilated into a genre, into a, even Vandermeer's book is a kind of genre into this weird ecology, right? So in terms of places you could go at the outside of quote unquote mainstream or pop culture, those places are kind of gone. We've sort of how would you say, we've kind of collided all types of subcultures into this sort of hyperculture or whatever you would call it. I mean, ayahuasca is more popular now, and psychedelics are getting slowly legalized. There's a lot of interesting fusions that are happening. They're really exciting, but the result is, of course, there's a critique about Burning Man every year and everything else. So where do we go for the weird anymore? But JF has brought up a great point, and Eric agreed in this podcast, that the weird is now it's bigger than just a subculture. We're kind of enveloped in a kind of hyper object of high strangeness, right? So it's another climate change concept is the Anthropocene. And the Anthropocene, if you're not familiar with it, is this idea that, we're living in an age of geological we're living in an age of kind of a geological combination where the human activities have reached a level so impactful on the environment that we have become a force of nature upon ourselves and the rest of the environment. We are the hurricanes barreling down on Florida and Houston and so on. So we have become sort of this combination of a natural force because of emergent human activities of climate change. So we're kind of we've kind of smashed into nature. So culture and nature and civilization and ecosystems are now part of this simultaneous and interlinked process. So in a way, it's kind of like thinking that, that tremendous storm barreling down on Houston, right? That monster, that sort of Leviathan is also us. And that's sort of that's the concept of the Anthropocene. So, and Bruno Latour talks a lot about this as well. And with talking about Gaia and sort of the new order and thinking about Gaia and climate change and how we have to start thinking about this kind of interlinked nature of culture and ecology. So that's sort of where I'm getting at. And another good thinker with this is probably on a similar note about sort of how we're living in this sort of hyper weird object where self and nature are mixing, right? And even technology and self as well, if you want to get at it from the tech angle. But Eugene Thacker's In the Dust of This Planet is another good book, kind of describing this receding of reason, the receding of the mental rational, in my words. And he describes like the world without us as a philosophical concept, and the horror of philosophy and the philosophy of horror, because he's using all sorts of fun media examples of horror movies and H.P. Lovecraft. The limits of reason are in this kind of unfathomable, again, annihilation kind of style of the knowable world, that the world isn't really knowable to anything that human beings in their constructed cultures and realities really get. And even ourselves, as Annihilation mentioned, as the biologists mentioned, that to re-quote that, right? So I knew that ultimately I would have to admit I knew less than nothing about myself as well. And it's this idea that what we are, who we are, our nature is this sort of numinous being. And that's something we share with, all of the phenomenal world. So I think in a way this is really good. This crisis is really working on our consciousness. And I don't want to say that everybody is, or that things are going great. In fact, in many ways, it's kind of the opposite. It wouldn't be a crisis otherwise. But the kind of thinking that we need is definitely coming online in artists like Vandermeer and philosophical works like hyper objects and Tim Morton, what he's doing. So and integral with Gebser. And I think this kind of thinking is really, this is the thinking of planetization that Teilhard was talking about, right? Planetization is the self as the storm, as the hurricane barreling down on Florida and Houston. That's planetization as well. And that's the kind of consciousness we really need to be starting to think in and through and with, an ecological consciousness, as it were. But again, an ecological consciousness is not safe. It's not looking at nature out there, right? It's the starfish in the pond in you. It's the Anthropocene hurricane in you, as you. That's the weirdness. That's the twist, the weirding, because weirding is sort of the etymology of the word, right? It means to kind of loop or twist. That's the weirding of thought that's happening. And Deleuze talks about this as well, that even, Descartes had his angel's dream, and the ends or limits of reason follows the witch's flight. So there's this idea that underneath the constructions of reason, like a tide that's now receding, there's something underneath that's sort of being rendered transparent. And of course, transparency, again, is sort of one of the themes, the characteristics of the integral age, as Gebser described. So all of this is transparency, certainly. The uncanniness of nature as this strange being, the starfish, the pond, the Anthropocene. These are all kind of rendering transparent of our phenomenal world. In the midst of a crisis that, we don't know how we're going to get out of or through this. But I certainly think that we have a better chance of a leap, a mutation, if we engage with this thinking. Otherwise, what are we doing? Are we just going to try to contain nature within civilization? I think it's much stranger. I think nature and civilization are no longer a dichotomy we can safely use without this sort of negative manifestation. And Thompson talks about this. I've probably mentioned this many times, but William Irwin Thompson describes sort of the cultural evolution as first happening through catastrophe. So it kind of happens in its negative, in its crisis, right? Or like a dark age, for instance. But we could kind of consider the climate crisis as a sort of retraction of the sort of mental rational expansion of civilization and industrial waste and so on. Hopefully it won't be a literal dark age as terrible as some of the climate scientists are saying, with the amount of changes that are happening and the amount we're not preparing for that. But damn. Yeah, Elliot saying, this reminds me, your mom said, point out to me that there is no nature. Nature is a human idea. Yeah. And, I want to also point out, like, even culture, anything. I mean, this is how far it goes, right? That anything, any kind of, even thought itself is strange. So, as I mentioned with Deleuze, even thought itself, thinking itself is an occult quality. There's a kind of unthinkableness, non-humanness, even of thought. The world, the world without us, the non-human world, not in terms of like the Discovery show, but the philosophical concept of sort of that reason and thought and idea and even myth and imagination and even culture itself is something that we don't even fully own. It's stranger than we even imagine it to be. So yeah, and I think a lot of esoteric practices kind of get that, but I'm just kind of riffing right now. But yeah, guys, questions, comments, concerns, thought equals VR. Yeah, reality tunnels, right, Elliot? Yeah, William is saying we live in an age that's both scatological and eschatological. The shit is finally hitting the fan. Yeah, that's a good point, William. And yeah, and this is sort of Gebser's point that evolution, cultural evolution, is not a positivist project. It's a series of organic mutations and leaps and crises that that I just triggered Siri. Whoops. There may be some kind of emergence taking place, but in terms of mutation, it's in these breakdowns, the decomposition and deconstruction and crisis of a no longer the mode of thinking our civilization has been using to operate, not just as economic ideology, but as I mentioned with the Michael Brooks show, that recently I was on the podcast, and we're talking about Marxism and Gebser and sort of economics, and how, you know, does an integral thinker root their thinking in an economic theory because that grounds it. And you know, I kind of see it as like a Mobius strip, right, rather than grounding it specifically in an economic ideology or theory, even something like Marxism or so on. And that, you know, underlying economic ideologies is a kind of a structure of consciousness. And I think that's sort of where our geeky, weird cultural evolution integral thinkers can be kind of useful in understanding the underlying structures of particular economic ideologies and so on. And sort of how and when and why they're breaking down in their multifaceted ways, you know, because there's a kind of a systemic breakdown. But underneath, I think the systemic breakdown is a structure of thinking that is deficient, as it were. It's no longer working. It's sort of in it's outlived itself, as Gebser says. So Joseph's saying the arch-druid John Michael Greer's fiction works are very much like this line of Lovecraftian weird ecology. Cool. I gotta check him out. As you mentioned him before. I know I have his version of the Picatrix, his translation, and I just haven't really dived into that or his fiction. So I definitely want to do that. But yeah, guys, comments or questions? Do I recommend Annihilation? Yeah. The book and the movie. And I mentioned, you know, the book and the movie are so different from each other. And the movie, as I was mentioning in some of my reading from my article, the movie is more interested in exploring cell mitosis and sort of a David Lynchian image of the doppelganger, right? Like looking at yourself. And he was really interested in that in the film. I don't want to get into too many spoilers, but it's all over, you know, it's right away, you know, you kind of get it right away in the film, and it's all over the books, the idea of copies, duplicates, strange doppelgangers. The movie itself is a strange doppelganger, a strange cell mitosis of the book. It's very different. It's a mutation. So yeah, I definitely recommend it. And at least for the third act, I mean, some people have had problems with the first two acts because they've read the books and it didn't really line up. I think it's fine as it is, as a standalone film, as an independent take on Annihilation. And the third act is a cinematic experience. That's something you want to encounter in the movies, or just in general. It's just like the thing you go to. It's like Solaris, 2001: A Space Odyssey, the ending. Dave Zuckerman was mentioning a few other movies we need to watch. Arrival, a couple of those. It's in that kind of genre of kind of wait till the third act and then pull the rug of reality out from under you. So I definitely recommend it. So which schools have the best integral philosophy programs / classes? That's a hard question to answer. I really like, I would probably just off the bat recommend CIIS in terms of their lineage and their history. I mean, if you read books like Esalen by Jeffrey Kripal that kind of talk about the history of, really the whole like East-West spirituality, you know, in the counterculture from the 50s onward, a lot of it happened at CIIS. Alan Watts was there, Haridas Chaudhuri was there, bringing Sri Aurobindo, and then Michael Murphy was a student there who went on did Esalen. So it's kind of a spawning ground for a lot of integral thinking, integral consciousness that, you know, Wilbur and the other folks who came later in America would draw from. But Yeah, I would just look at CIS and the history of CIS, and they're very focused on ecology right now as well. It's a private school, and of course something like this, right? But they've got some great faculty there between like Rick Tarnas and Sean Kelly and Robert McDermott. Trying to think. The institutionalization of these ideas are sort of rare, and so places like CIS are very very much appreciated, for kind of holding that space in academic discourse, right? So I'd probably recommend that. I'd probably recommend that the most, just kind of getting involved with those thinkers and their writings and stuff. So, and the other would be, I mean, we'll see, right? What Nura's doing. And what I want to do is bring in more integral thinkers there as kind of an online sort of, there's a big pull right now for like vloggers and the sort of YouTube University kind of philosophical culture, and has created these weird undergrounds, like with Jordan Peterson, for example, and so on. But I think there's plenty of room for the consciousness culture to continue to be, intellectual and sort of vibrant, right? And sort of continuing a kind of critical discourse with popular culture in that way. I don't follow Steven Shafiro's work, no. But yeah, link it to me if anything particular you think would really vibe well with what I've been riffing on here. But let's see, it's 1:53, so we can go a few more minutes. But anybody has questions, comments, thoughts, your own thoughts we can riff on together? That'd be cool. Because those are my only contributions today, mutations and everything. I guess the last thing, I mean, we had a fun, a few of us, David and a few of my friends here, we had a fun conversation about just riffing on Goethe and imagination and nature and thinking about. So when you read the books, Annihilation, Vandermeer, all of it, the whole trilogy, it really kind of gets you in a weird ecology state of mind. And I was even reading kind of mystical writings in the language of Area X, and when you read the books, you'll kind of get what I mean about that. So that was kind of fun. But I was thinking about time as sort of an integral Area X component, right? Like time is this idea of so Area X is a place, but also throughout the book and the movie, there's a lot of time distortion. I think that's really interesting because Gepser was always talking about time, the achronon, as this sort of a-perspectival mode of time that's sort of multidimensional with different folds and facets and dimensions of time kind of all a part of itself. So that's what I was thinking of. Then I was also thinking of evolution as a whole. As this kind of strange imaginal series of transformations, right? So like, as I mentioned, I was looking at these early whale ancestors. It's basically these dogs that lived on the shore, on the ocean, the shore of like an ocean. And if you kind of see everything sped up, right? If you explore this from a temporal perspective, you get a kind of weird Area X transformation of this little creature dipping its being into the sea, and then across time becoming monstrously huge and massive and fanning out across different forms. So life itself is very strange if you think about it in that way. And Teilhard had a very poetic appreciation, Teilhard de Chardin, of nature in that way too. And the way he describes in a lot of his writings the evolution of hominids is a sort of, you kind of have to participate with it in a kind of Goethean sense, right? Of the imagination sort of coming to know nature and its sort of interiority, right? And sort of seeing the fanning out of these hominids in this intensification process with consciousness happening. I don't know, I don't know how much it holds up with sort of contemporary neo-Darwinian thinking, and I'm sure most neo-Darwinists have rejected Teilhard long ago. but still, it's just a very beautiful Goethean, as I'm saying, participation with evolution and imagination, which again lends itself, as I'm saying, going in a circle with Annihilation and Area X and that kind of Anthropocene, a-perspectival thinking. This whole thing, Elliot's saying, made me think of Giger and cyborg anthropology. Yeah, I mean, like, we could go in another direction, right? On one hand, and this is what my book's exploring too, passages, you got the ecology thing, which is already talking about this, the Anthropocene, the smashing of nature and culture, civilization and ecosystems, human and non-human, the sort of bleeding out of the human world into the non-human world and the non-human turn. But then that also has to do with what you're saying about cyborg anthropology, right? And the what do you call it? Ghost in the Shell is a great example, right? From the 1990s, not the new one, of this sort of non-human turn with technology, this sort of becoming as symbiotic with our machines. At the same time, we're learning about how symbiotic we are with ecosystems and so on. So I think there's a convergence point here that needs to be talked about in terms of technology and ecology as a sort of emergent understanding. So at least mentioning Tom Campbell argues that evolution is more fundamental and important than space-time. Interesting. So he calls it the fundamental process. Cool. I gotta read me some more Tom Campbell, Elliot. You gotta hook me up with that. So Derek's saying that we'd love to hear your take on Henry Corbin's imaginal realm. Maybe another time. Sure. I mean, just like what was I gonna say? Just shortly, just like really briefly, I haven't read Corbin too much. I have read books about Corbin. I think Tom Cheatham's work is amazing. I have read All the World and Icon, and that was probably one of my favorite books. And I really love what he had to say about this sort of rendering, sort of seeing the world inside out, right? That was his first book. And I think that imaginal approach is certainly in convergence with the sort of Goethean, Steinerian approach to nature. And that's good. And I think it's useful to think about that because, like Gary Lockman was saying last week during my interview with him that, we've kind of moved away from this imaginal participation, or as William Aaron Thompson says, a mythopoetic participation with the natural world. And in the pre-modern times, a lot of this was kind of the theological imagination as a kind of, you can grasp reality with it, right? You can participate with reality with these archetypes and religious iconography and this sort of living imagination. So where am I going with this? That kind of withered away with scientism and materialism, even though it still is kind of unconscious baseline for it. And so kind of resurrecting that in a sort of Goethean science or mythopoetic, metanoic approach to science and mysticism and esotericism, certainly important. And I think that's what's happening in terms of like what Vandermeer's doing and so on. But we can dive into that another time. This is my cat letting me know she woke up. But so thanks, Elliot, too, for the link. Awesome. Let's see if there's anything else to really cover here. I think Joseph linked to me The American Replacement of Nature by William Irwin Thompson. Everyday Acts and Outrageous Evolution of Economic Life. Yeah, that's a great book. I was actually kind of studying that book for my own passages because it's a series of essays kind of riffing. And it's I definitely recommend that for anybody here. And as a Floridian now, as I've moved to Florida a few years ago. As a Floridian now, I really appreciated the critiques and the sort of satirical play of Disney and everything else and the simulacrum. So what I think, decades on from that book, this gets weirder than just that. I'm sure all of those things still apply, even more so. We're living in a Baudrillard, Philip K. Dickian reality more so than ever before. But it's also all these other weird things they're talking about with hyperobjects and so on. So I think even all of that as a kind of the American replacement of nature as a project that our civilization is doing, and the kind of replacement of even the esoteric bodies with technological apparatus through like VR. That's what he was kind of talking about back then. And if you listen to his talks, he's got a good video series on YouTube from the early 90s talking about this book and how like Whole Earth Catalog and a lot of those like cyber futurist guys, like Mondo 2000 guys, and all those folks that they are having trouble with this book because it was kind of critiquing technology as a kind of pseudomorphic replacement of these sort of mystical, esoteric, spiritual dimensions of the human body and so on, or the astral plane. And he talks about that too, and coming into being is sort of like the internet is sort of the invasion of the astral plane, or kind of a mimicry of it. And I think that's really interesting and weird that we would do that unconsciously, that science would do that. And perhaps there's a reason for that. Perhaps it's because, we've sort of repressed that so much that it's again, reason follows the witch's flight. And so, the fact that technology and the occult and esoteric schools of thinking pop up through our technology without us even realizing it, yeah, like it's because we're kind of ignoring the dimension of thought itself as being occult. And so like reason will produce monsters and magic, right? And that's like technosis from Eric Davis. So I think like totally. But yeah, I'm on a tangent. And I've heard of the Dark Mountain Project, beautiful project. I've read about it. And I think it's a very similar project to what Eugene Thacker is talking about with The World Without Us and the non-human turn. And just sort of a beautiful meditation on the kind of limits of that. And I think the limits of the mental irrational. But yeah, I could go on and on, guys, and it's been about an hour, so I think I'll close it here. But this is really fun, and I think I want to do this a little bit more often as my, let me link to my Patreon too, guys. Let me link to it. So if you want an inside scoop, and really that is, if interviews go on before not being live, they will be on Patreon first for me. And I'm also going to be announcing some of my editorial projects as well as my book writing on there. The book is a few months out from being shareable. Hopefully this summer I can start to share pieces with you, maybe June or so. And the anthology is going to be coming much sooner than that, thankfully, at least in terms of the announcement and call for papers. So you'll get an inside scoop with all that. If you want to sign up for my Patreon, I'd be much obliged. It allows me to kind of make this more of my focus than it is. I do a lot of freelance work right now. I enjoy it, but the more time I can focus on writing and research and producing content, the better. So the podcast, Revelor, my book writing as a whole, and sort of helping to kind of craft this sort of network of consciousness, culture, thinking, and writing. Not just me. With Revelor, what I'm doing is really kind of building out a platform for scholars to publish and reference each other and sort of kick up and revive, the intellectual consciousness culture, as I've been saying. So, I'm really kind of, it's experimental. It's just trying to build that, where there's a gap, trying to build it. So that's what really I want to focus on is, of course, my writing, of course, contributing to scholarly discussions and thinking about integral consciousness and the Anthropocene and the modern world and so on. But also doing that with peers, which is a lot of you guys are listening today. So, so thanks for listening, guys. Thanks for tuning in. Thanks, Elliot, for your questions, and Joseph and Derek. And thanks, Karen and Ed and Diana and Juma and Joran and Mary and Michael. Oh my gosh, a lot of people today. Thank you, everybody. It's like almost too much to list here. So thanks everyone for tuning in. Link up with my Patreon, link up with my GoFundMe for the conference if you can. Any support is appreciated. Even just sort of being here is much appreciated. So I'll catch you guys next time, and we'll probably do this next week, and either with Jen's art or Connor Habib, we'll see what's first. But yep, thanks for tuning in, guys. Have a great day.